You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by L. Lee Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 24. The turnout for the funeral of Stanley Peters was not nearly as big as the turnout for the auction of Stanley Peters's belongings. Surprisingly, many Himmel townsfolk did show up for the memorial service to offer support for Stanley's grieving widow, Ellen. She had been a respected member of the town all her life. For a quarter of a century, she had served as a beloved elementary school teacher. Since Stanley Peters hadn't the interest in making prearranged funeral plans, Stan Jr. took it upon himself to use a portion of the proceeds from the auction to purchase a casket and plot for his father's body. The memorial service was held at the local funeral home. Although Stan Jr. tried to talk Pastor Anderson of Himmel Lutheran into performing the memorial service, the pastor believed it might be somewhat offensive to the long-standing members of the church to hold Stanley's funeral there. True, Ellie and Stan were members of the church, but Stanley himself had never attended a service there. In fact, Pastor Anderson was concerned that some of the Lutheran parishioners might consider the simple act of carting Stanley Peters' dead body into the sanctuary a bit sacrilegious. That being said, the Himmel Funeral Home reluctantly held the funeral service for Stanley. Because he could find no other willing participant to eulogize his father, Stan Jr. decided to say a few words in his father's memory. He stood at the podium, gazing down at Stanley's closed casket, which was draped in flowers. No one here would ever dare say that my father, Stanley Peters Senior, was a good and decent man. He was hard to live with. He was hard on everyone who loved him. He was stubborn. And sometimes he could be downright mean. Mom had told me once that Dad came to town 27 years ago after his first son, Robert, had been killed in Vietnam. Here in Himmel, he met Mom. He married her, and he made Himmel and Grandpa Anders' farm his home. I'm glad for that. I grew up here, knowing the people of this town, working with them and loving them. Even though my dad was hard on people, I never felt judged by others here because of him. I once asked Mom what she might have seen in Dad when she married him. He seemed mad all the time, especially at her. And you know what she told me? She said she had dated his first son, Robert, for many years. He was a very good man. I would have liked him. Then she said that I was a good young man. And she said, if Stanley could father two such wonderful young men, there has to be something good about his character. Something wonderful that nobody else could see. I'm standing here today because I just wanted to say, Dad, I hope that you and Robert are together and happy. And I hope that the good part of your character is enough good to gain you access to the pearly gates of heaven. Maybe one day I'll see you both there. You and my big brother, Robert. Goodbye, Dad. I love you. Stan Jr. walked softly beside his father's casket and gently rested his hand on the coffin. Ellen sobbed weakly. In contrast, Margie sat behind her, practically wailing. I don't know why I'm bawling, she cried as she blew her nose into a handful of tissue. I hated Stanley. Ellie patted her sister supportively on the back. Thanks for being here, hon. I can't tell you how much it means to me and Stan. As was customary, the director of the Himmel Funeral Home entreated volunteers to share testimony regarding the deceased. Anybody? Feel free to stand and share your memories of Stanley with us. Of course, about 4 minutes of complete silence ensued since no one had anything nice to say about Stanley. Finally, William Knutson came forward. He nervously cleared his throat as he addressed the mourners. Hi, my name is William Knutson. I've lived in Himmel all my life. As a matter of fact, I went to school with Miss Ellie here, who was Stanley's wife. There's not a whole lot to say about Stanley. Mostly I just sat next to him at the trading post. Doris brought him drinks. He nodded and waved at Doris. He loved his Jack Daniels bourbon, and he loved those two sons, Robert and Stan Jr. He bragged about 'em all the time. When Stanley got to drinking, he'd sometimes lay into me about Miss Ellie. I think he must have loved her something fierce if he could get so worked up in trying to slug me. He did that a couple of times. He wasn't a sure shot, but he seemed to throw those punches at the wind something wild. The mourners chuckled quietly, as William seemed to have run out of steam. Well, I guess I'll just finish by saying, so long, Stanley. See ya in the big bar up in the sky, eh? William Knutson returned to his seat as the service closed. The majority of the attendees gathered in the funeral home lobby, while immediate family members and close friends marched 2 blocks down to the Himmel Cemetery. Stan Jr. had managed to extend the Sievertson family plot to include 2 extra plots next to his great-grandmother Sigrid's grave. One plot was intended for Stanley, and the plot next to Stanley's had been purchased for Ellie whenever she passed away. Ellie took Stan Jr.'s arm during the short journey behind the hearse, which contained Stanley's coffin. That was a fine thing you said about your father, Stan. I'm so proud of you. Stan Jr. seemed miffed at his mother. I don't understand why you're not more upset, Mom. Ellen was baffled. I don't understand what you mean, son. How am I supposed to act? More upset than you are, he answered smartly. He was still clearly shaken. He handed her a check for the remainder of the auction proceeds. What's this? Ellie asked. It's the money from the auction. Now you and Aunt Marge don't have to do that 900 number nonsense anymore. Stan pleaded with his mother sincerely while he handed her the check. Ellen glanced down at the sum on the check. Oh, my heavens, she exclaimed. She gratefully kissed Stan on the cheek. Thank you so much, son. And she wiped her lipstick off his cheek with her thumb. You were always such a good boy. He pleaded with her again. So you're going to shut down the 900 numbers and retire? Stan Jr. was almost demanding her compliance now. Oh, heavens no, Ellie replied. I have no intention of giving up now. Stan was perplexed. No, Mom, he commanded. I won't have you do that anymore. You're too good for that. I won't stand for it. Well, son, Ellen answered defiantly, I'm not sure that's your decision to make. I'm just saying, Mom, I don't think you should be doing that. I worry about you. I know you do, Stan, hon. But there's a lot you don't know about me. Really, son. I can take care of myself. I'll be fine, she assured him. Marge was 10 steps behind Ellie and Stan, walking beside Paul and Doris Baker. Paul had pulled Stanley's copy of The Pale Horse out of his suit pocket, careful not to let Ellie see. Marge, I know this really isn't the time nor the place, but I got to ask you something, Paul began. Sure, Paul, what is it? See this book here? He showed her the Agatha Christie book. Sure, that was Stanley's book. We packed it in the box for the auction. Well, does your sister still eat lutefisk? Paul inquired. Nah, we hated that crap. Grandmother and father were the only people in the family who ate that stuff. None of us kids ever liked it, Margie stated. She stuck out her tongue and shivered in disgust. Sorry, Paul. Just the mere thought of eating that gelatinous, stinky fish crap makes me want to throw up. Well, here's the thing. We've been trying to figure out whose writing this is. He opened the inside back cover, etched with misspelled scrawls. I'm pretty sure it's Stanley's handwriting. She took the book from him as she examined the inside cover more closely. Definitely. Who else's writing would it be? I know it's not Ellie's. She read the scrawls more carefully. Wait, yum yum rat victuals? Ellie still has a half-used box of that crap under her sink. When the funeral party arrived at the cemetery, little additional tribute was paid to Stanley. Pastor Anderson read a few passages from the New Testament, and the consecration of the grave was complete. The majority of the crowd had retreated. Ellen, Stan, Rosa, Sheriff Baker, and Doris were left standing at the gravesite. Ellen tossed a handful of dirt onto Stanley's grave as the coffin was lowered into the soil. So long, Stanley. I hope you find peace here. She glanced over at Sigrid's grave marker. It was nice of Stan Jr. to find a plot right next to grandmother. As she turned back to her spouse's coffin, she said, "Now you can take care of her in heaven, Stanley." Paul, Marge, and Doris stood a few feet behind Ellen as she quietly said her goodbyes to her late husband. But upon hearing Ellen's comments about her deceased grandmother, Margie stepped forward. She placed her arm around her younger sister. "Ellie, dear, didn't you say that grandmother hated Stanley?" "Why, yes, Margie, I told you. After Stan Jr. was born, she tried to talk me into divorcing poor Stanley. 'He's just a drone bee now,' she would say. 'The queen has laid the egg. Winter's come. Time to send him away from the hive.' She really hated Stanley." Marge glanced suspiciously behind her shoulder toward Paul. She quizzed her little sister some more. "But you said that Stanley loved Grandmother Sigrid." "Well, yeah, hon. I'm pretty sure he knew she didn't like him. I think he even overheard her say that we didn't need him around anymore. But he never once said a cross word to her," Ellen informed her. Marge was clearly in interrogation mode now. "And Stanley took care of grandmother just before she died?" "Oh, yeah. I had to teach school, you know. So Stanley stayed home and took care of the baby and grandmother." Ellen smiled. "He was so good to her. He even had Mrs. Olstad make lutefisk special just for her. She ate that right up till the very end, till she couldn't even keep that down anymore," Ellen stated innocently. Paul stepped up to Ellen as he spoke. "What did your grandma die of again, Miss Sievertson?" "Don't know for sure. She died suddenly in just a few days. She had a terribly high fever. It was awful. And she complained that her feet hurt her." "Her feet?" Paul inquired, puzzled. "Yeah, she said that she felt like there were 1,000 little needles poking into the soles of her feet. And I remember sitting at her bedside reading to her. One night, I leaned over to kiss her goodnight, and her hair came off in a tuft in my hand. Oh my gosh, I was horrified. I started to scream. Well, Stanley came in and calmed me down. He really was good to her. Anyways, she died shortly after that. Don't you know, Marge? I tried a couple of times to get her to see a doctor, but she never would have it." Ellen looked horrified as she recounted the gruesome story of her grandmother's sudden death. "I kept that lock of her hair in the box under my bed. You know, the box with all of Robert's letters?" Margie nodded. She was uncharacteristically speechless as she struggled to assemble the details of Sigrid's passing. She stood, largely motionless and dazed. "Well, hon, I guess I'm going to go over and brush off Robert's grave while I'm here," she stated. Stan Jr. followed closely behind his mother as the pair left for Robert's family plot on the far side of the cemetery. After Ellen excused herself, Margie frowned at Paul Baker. "Sheriff?" "Yes, Miss Marge?" "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" "I think I am," Paul acknowledged. Doris interjected. "I think we are all thinking what you're thinking, Marge." Marge scowled at Stanley's coffin, now seated in its freshly dug hole 6 feet below. She hatefully kicked more dirt into the grave and shouted, "You burn in hell, Stanley Peters." Ellen Sievertson attentively brushed dirt off the modest gravestone of Robert Peters as she knelt down in the grass. She hung her head and sobbed quietly to herself. Stan Jr. stood behind her. Mom? She failed to hear him. She was too entrenched in her own grief and self-pity to hear anyone. He spoke louder, this time almost yelling. Mom, I'm talking to you. She glanced up at her son, clearly in distress. Oh, heavens. I'm sorry, Robert. I didn't mean to ignore you. Stan Jr. was outraged. Not only was his grief-stricken mother ignoring his pleas for attention, she had called him by the wrong name once again. Mom, I'm Stan Jr. What, son? You called me Robert again, Mom. Stan Jr. was overwrought. Oh, dear. I'm sorry, son. You're sorry? Really, Mom? You're sorry? He shook his head in disbelief. I just don't get it. I just do not get it. Ellen swabbed her wet nose with her handkerchief and rose to her feet. What, son? What don't you get? I don't get how you're more worked up over Robert being dead than my own father. How does that happen? He inquired impatiently. What? You mean Stanley? Yes, Mom. Stanley. Remember Stanley? You had a child by him. You lived with him for 27 friggin' years. You clubbed him over the head with a lexapin? Yeah, that's Stanley. Stan yelled disrespectfully at his mother now. What's wrong with you, Mom? Well, son, for starters, Stanley isn't your real father, she stated calmly. Huh? Stan Jr. glared at his mother, speechless. Ellen shook her head as she mumbled, I know I should have told you a long time ago, son. I really meant to tell you, but things didn't seem to turn out the way we had planned. The way who planned? Stan was clearly tormented now. He didn't know if Ellie was telling him the truth or leading him into some crazy fantasy of hers. The way your great-grandmother and I planned, Ellen stated. What are you talking about, Mom? Have you completely lost it? No, dear. I'm very sane, Ellen assured him. She seemed suddenly concerned by the look of anguish in her son's weary face. Oh, goodness, son. Have a seat. You look white as a sheet. She motioned for Stan Jr. to be seated on a nearby bench while she sat next to him. I've got to tell you a story now, and I know you might get mad at me, but I'm going to tell you the truth anyways. It's time for me to just come clean once and for all.